Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dorothy Kaczynski. I'm the Vredenberg Director and CEO of the Phillips Collection, and I'm very pleased that you've joined us here this afternoon. We apparently had, I don't know how many actually entered the virtual room, but we had over 400 registrants, so we're very glad that there's such a robust interest in this topic. So, Picasso, Painting the Blue Period, is a unique combination of innovative art historical research and new information gleaned from the advanced technical studies of 3 Blue Period paintings in the respective collections of the exhibition co-organizers, we, the Phillips Collection, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. The Blue Period is normally understood to have spanned the years 1901 to 1904, and it is the first significant style development in Picasso's 70-plus year career. In 1901, Picasso was 19 years old. Actually, for me, and following some of the critical reviews, I found that to be a linchpin in understanding what we're seeing upstairs, is his youth and his groping forward towards a more confident artistic practice. Cutting-edge conservation studies undertaken by the Phillips and the AGO form the foundation of the exhibition, which expand our understanding of the creative process of Picasso during this seminal period. This is the first exhibit to approach the Blue Period from this vantage point. The program today brings together the individuals responsible for both the technical studies here at the Phillips and the AGO collections, and the concurrent curatorial investigations that inform the exhibition. Exhibition co-curators are Sue Behrends-Frank, curator here at the Phillips, and Kenneth Brummel, formerly associate curator of modern art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and now the curator of 20th-century art at the Joslyn Art Museum. Patricia Favero, associate conservator at the Phillips, and Sandra Webster-Cook, now conservator emerita at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and John Delaney, chief imaging scientist at the National Gallery of Art. Harry Cooper, senior curator of modern art at the National Gallery of Art, is the 6th member of our panel. Although he has not been part of our exhibition project, he is our outside expert with extensive understanding of Cubist Picasso and familiarity with the Blue Period works at the National Gallery. He is well positioned to give insight into how the information in this exhibition offers insight into Picasso's artistic practice in a larger context. Conservation has been an essential part of the Phillips collection since 1989. We may be a moderately sized museum, but we bring our A game to conservation studies of the works of art in our collection. Through the support and continuing investment today by the Sherman Fairchild Foundation, our expanded state-of-the-art conservation facility, which opened on the top floor of this building in 2006, has allowed the number of exhibition projects with a conservation component inspired by works in our collection to grow exponentially over the past decade. Picasso, Painting the Blue, is the most ambitious of these exhibitions, with its emphasis in the galleries on conservation studies as essential components to the exhibition's insights into the artist's creative process. In 2007, our associate conservator, Patty Favero, undertook a new examination of our Blue Room. With my support and that of the curators, in 2012, Patty initiated a multi-institutional collaboration that brought together scientists with expertise in physics and chemistry from the National Gallery of Art, the Winterthur Museum, and Cornell University, where we sent our painting in 2012 to be scanned by an exceptionally fast X-ray detector at the Cornell High Energy Synchrotron Source, CHESS. This unique collaboration of scientists and conservators studying works of art is something only a very small number of museums in the world have the capacity to do. We're so very lucky that our crosstown colleagues at the National Gallery are one of those exceptionally rare institutions. Dr. John Delaney, Chief Imaging Scientist at the NGA, is with us today, as I said. He is internationally recognized as one of the leaders in this new field, having developed one-of-a-kind multi- and hyperspectral imaging cameras that can reveal in remarkable detail images that lie beneath the painted surface. We're very grateful to him for all he's contributed to this project. He worked with Patty Favero since the earliest days of her investigations of the Blue Room. In fact, he generously gave of his time and expertise to image our painting on 4 separate occasions between 2012 and 2019. When the Art Gallery of Ontario joined the Phillips in 2014 to co-organize this exhibition, the AGO's chief conservator, Sandra Webster-Cook, also engaged with Dr. Delaney to image their Blue Period paintings. In 2018, in support of our exhibition, the AGO sponsored Dr. Delaney's travel to Japan to do technical studies on 2 important Blue Period works at the Pola Art Museum and the Hiroshima Art Museum. And they are in our exhibition. And today he will present the results of his studies on the works in the Pola Art Museum that are on view. Dr. Delaney also brings us the results of his technical analysis of 2 of the National Gallery's Blue Period Picassos, works that directly relate to our project but are restricted from loan. This exhibition is generously supported by the Phillips by the Edna Root Foundation, Share Fund, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional support is provided by Lee M. Yarbrough. Our exhibition fund is made possible by our endowment, supported by the Sherman Fairchild Foundation, Michelle and Glenn Engelman, Robert and Deborah Drumheller, and the Marion F. Golding Charitable Fund. And in addition, we are supported by a generous indemnity from the National Council on the Arts and Humanities. So with that long and detailed introduction, I cede the stage to my distinguished colleagues, and once again, thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I'm just going to briefly here introduce.
I have to turn your mic off.
I think I have too many microphones on. So I'm going to introduce the colleagues that are seated on the stage, just so you know a little bit about their background, because this is an interdisciplinary project that requires a village to really produce. So my co-curator is Kenneth Brummel here, the gentleman in the glasses nodding on the couch. He and I met when I went to the Art Gallery of Ontario in the fall of 2014, and over the course of 8+ years, we've become kind of like siblings who really kind of shares such enthusiasm, and we've had such a great time on this exhibition. And he was the associate curator of modern art at the Art Gallery of Ontario, but has moved on into a new position in Omaha as the curator of 20th-century art at the Joslyn Art Museum. And, you know, prior to joining the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2014, Kenneth held curatorial positions in a number of major art museums. And, you know, has worked on not only our Picasso exhibition, but also a major exhibition in 2021 on Andy Warhol, on Mitchell Riopel, Anthony Caro, and other projects. So I want to introduce also my colleague at the Phillips, Patty Favero, who is the associate curator of conservation here. And, you know, her specialty is the conservation of paintings. She holds a Master's of Arts with a Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from SUNY Buffalo State College. And before she joined the Phillips in 2004, I can't believe, like 18 years ago, Patty, She had completed fellowships at the Cincinnati Art Museum and at the Tate in London. And in addition to studying Picasso on and off since 2008, she has participated in technical studies of paintings in our collection by Edgar Degas and published on the materials and techniques of Georges Braque's mid-career still life paintings. Sandra Webster-Cook, whom you see seated between Kenneth and Harry. She is Conservator Emerita now, but has worked on the research and multidisciplinary exhibition that we have upstairs after serving 33 years at the Art Gallery of Ontario as the head of their conservation department. She was responsible for the conservation at the AGO of historical and modern paintings in their collection and carried out research and major conservation treatments of masterpieces by Tom Thomson, Chardin, Rembrandt, and Rubens. Dr. John Delaney, that you see seated on the couch next to Patty, is the senior imaging scientist in the Scientific Research Department of the National Gallery of Art. And his research focuses on the adaptation of remote sensing sensors and processing methods for the study of paintings and works on paper. Currently, he is an associate editor for Science Advances in the area of physical and material sciences and on the editorial board for Heritage Science. He is also an affiliated faculty member in the Chester F. Carlson Center for Imaging Science at the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. And Harry Cooper, over here on the far end of our panel, is the Senior Curator of Modern Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. A native of Bethesda, Harry earned his MA from Johns Hopkins and his PhD from Harvard. He has worked at the Harvard Art Museums for a decade, and he collaborated there with Ron Sprunk on a major project, Mondrian, the Transatlantic Paintings, a 2001 exhibition and research project that merged technical analysis with art history. And that project received the College Art Association Award for Distinction in Scholarship and Preservation. His latest show is the retrospective on the art of Philip Guston that just recently opened at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but will be at the National Gallery after the first of the year. And he says he knows a lot more about Cubism than he does the Blue Period, but I know he's going to have a lot to share with us today, give additional insights. And I'm Sue Frank. I've been here at the Phillips Collection my entire curatorial career. I received my PhD in 1996, and the next year, 97, I joined the Phillips. And so I have been a lucky person to have had such a wonderful institution and good colleagues to work with. And work on a project like this is something that every curator dreams about. So I also want to say that we have some goals today. We want this program to share with you how technical studies of Picasso's Blue Period paintings enabled us to better understand the artist's working process. There are different examples of recycling canvases in this period. Picasso recycled his own canvases, and there are examples that indicate he recycled the work of others. Some canvases, even in our exhibition upstairs, have multiple paintings beneath them. Others have motifs, not finished complete compositions. And so it raises questions about Picasso's practice, his palette that he was using that we get to understand better through pigment analysis, and also his subject matter and how all of this kind of fits in with his ambition, of which there was a lot. So I turn it now over to my colleague, Patty Favero, to go and begin discussing the findings that she had on her very large interdisciplinary project that she initiated. No, just stay there.
Great. Thank you, Sue. I think I need my, thank you. Nobody's going to be able to hear me if my mic's not on.
I wanted to start with quick acknowledgements. Dorothy ran through, sorry. Anyway, I want to just acknowledge the expertise, the vast expertise that went into this study, and the generosity of our colleagues and the support of our colleagues at the Phillips Collection. So on your left is the Blue Room, and on your right is the painting that we found underneath. Dorothy said 2007, it's been a long time, 2007, 2008. We were first able to, using our camera here at the Phillips Collection, our infrared camera here at the Phillips Collection, first able to get a good image of a painting that's underneath the Blue Room that was long suspected to be there. And this kicked off our comprehensive study of both of these paintings. We had many questions. We wanted to know if Picasso painted the portrait. Everybody wanted to know who the man was. We also wanted to know when the portrait was painted and how that affected our understanding of when the Blue Room was painted. So we used three main techniques which Dorothy touched on, and I'm not going to explain in detail. But pigment analysis, paint sample analysis, and pigment analysis are very. It's one of the techniques. Of course, infrared imaging spectroscopy, infrared hyperspectral imaging. Okay, I defer to you, John. And on the left is an image from the first time that we did it, that we did the imaging at the Phillips Collection Conservation Studio. And on your right is the most recent campaign where we were looking at the painting with transmitted light instead of reflected light. Thank you.
Oh, great.
Is this on? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. And then Dorothy mentioned that we took the painting to Cornell, to the high energy synchrotron source. And this was an exceptional trip, but it yielded a lot of really valuable data for us. So we wanted to obtain the best images that we could of the hidden portrait. We wanted to describe the palette, as Sue mentioned, and we just, in general, wanted to learn more about Picasso's painting techniques. So imaging from the National Gallery, John's Imaging, supplied us with the best images of the painting. Really wonderful. You can see just the high definition texture of the brush strokes. If we had a close-up of the face, you would see how defined the features of the face are. A lot of texture here and broad brush strokes in the background. Also, you can see the defined outlines of the figure and sort of this stylized form. This allowed us to go into Picasso's, what we knew of Picasso's work from around the time, 1901, and be able to start comparing with other paintings. We didn't find any drawings, unfortunately, but of course you see that this woman with necklace has a similar gesture, but also just in stylistically very similar. And through close examination in the conservation studio, through the examination microscope, we know that this cushion behind the man is a chrome yellow. Well, that was through pigment analysis, but we can see the yellow through the thin paint layers of the Blue Room. And so we can compare with woman with a necklace there as well. This was a great opportunity. During conservation treatment, we took the painting off the stretcher and we were able to get a different image with transmitted light coming through the back of the painting rather than reflected off the surface. It gives us even more information about Picasso's technique, about his method, about his approach. We have, again, these broad brushstrokes in the background, but you also can get the detail of these hatched or zigzag brushstrokes here, which, again, correspond with another 1901 picture portrait of Bibi La Purée, amongst others. You have broad strokes in the background, and then he's defining the form of his tie. Picasso's defining the form of Bibi's tie with these hatch marks. Also, some evidence of thin fluid paint drips, again, that we see in other works by Picasso. This example, Woman at the Theater, also again from 1901. Pigment analysis, three major takeaways from that were that we suspected that the that the blue room was painted directly over the portrait, and we see no intermediary layer or separation layer in the cross sections. So that confirms that Picasso painted the blue room directly over the portrait, that the portrait was dry when Picasso painted over it, and also we were able to identify pigments. Thank you.
Quick question, yeah. The colors that you see in the cross-section, are they indicative of what the colors would have been in the final painting?
Yes. Thank you for that question. That's a good question. I would be very happy to go into detail about these cross sections, but I only have 5 minutes, and probably there already. But I do want to say that we see a lot of the same pigments in both paintings, but not only the same pigments, we see the same pigment mixtures. So in the SEM, you start to see the same mixture of elements that define the pigments, and this gives us a good indication that Picasso painted both, or the same palette painted both paintings. So we're going to go with Picasso there. The really amazing thing for me as a conservator about these techniques that we used, infrared imaging and synchrotron radiation, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, is that what you find in the pigment analysis, that's from just really discrete areas of the painting, tiny paint samples. And with the spectroscopy, you can take and map the pigments over the whole painting. And so this is showing us how Picasso is using his pigments. There's some limitation with this for this particular painting because we have the same pigments in both paintings and we have no separation layer. But it's still extremely powerful, and you don't have to take a sample. It's amazing. So finally, the major takeaway is that all of these techniques taken together in context with what we know about the painting and in the close examination of the painting is really where we were able to find the details. And so this is, I'm glad that you asked that question. I gave it away. This is through the examination microscope in the conservation studio. This is in the center of the bed, and you can see some red pigment coming through the cracks. That's where this cross-section is taken from, so we can have that correlation. And because it was in this area of the infrared reflectance image, we thought, well, why is there red there? What's going on? So here we have an infrared pigment map of lead white, so we can see that the bow tie and the shirt front are lead white, but there's something, he's holding something in the center of his shirt that's not, even though it looks white here. And XRF imaging or mapping gives us a little oval. This is for the element mercury, which is a component of a red pigment vermilion, which is mercuric sulfide. So sort of just connecting the dots. And again, with the limitations, we weren't able to get a full color simulation, but we know that this whole area is strokes of yellow with what's behind. We don't know the outlines, dark blue. We get some of that, sorry, John, I'm just getting it in your eye. From some of these pigment maps, we know that the outlines are dark blue, and then we were able to image this, what I think is a flower in the middle of that he's holding, and again, another 1901 painting, and this one's at the National Gallery, A Still Life of Peonies, and that texture that we see in those images really corresponds with the texture that we see in this painting, which is in the show upstairs. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay.
So can you hear me does my mic project? Okay, great. So I just take this. So I'm going to have, if anybody here on the dais wants to go and chime in, please do. This is Patty's chart, and so I'm just going to let you speak to whatever it is that's significant here, since we're just reiterating the similarities between the two paintings in terms of pigments and mixtures. And one of the things that art historically, we needed to think about this figure in context of Picasso's work in 1901. And the National Gallery has this painting that I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with, this portrait of Petrus Magnac, who was Picasso's art agent during this period of 1901. And there are this X-radiograph in the center, and then the infrared reflectogram on the far right give indication that there was more to be seen on his figure than what we see today. My understanding, and John, you can certainly correct me if I go off the rails here, but my understanding is that this was more the tie, and there is a sash here around his waist that connects him more to the attire of a bullfighter. So he was in a costume. And what Picasso has done is he's made the figure of Magnac more like a poster image in the manner of, say, Toulouse-Lautrec. He's, used this very hard outline. He has flattened the figure of Magnac, left this red tie, which is very interesting because of that red image in the center of the white shirt of our gentleman. And then, the kind of overall flattening is something that we find in the posters of Toulouse-Lautrec that Picasso was very admiring of at this moment in 1900, 1901. And it's very interesting how he's taken the idea of a title, a name, a label, and he's put it up here in the upper left, Petrus Magnac, as if it were a poster. But the face of Magnac, is not this kind of simplification that we see in Toulouse-Lautrec. It's much more naturalistic. It's really, his face is a portrait of Magnac in that regard. And so our guy, is also so kind of detailed in the manner in which his face has been depicted that Patty and I spent like 2 years trying to figure out who he might be. And we never found any confident resolution about an individual that we could identify for certain as being this figure. But we were able to compare it stylistically and compositionally, if you will, with the portrait of Coquillot, Gustave Coquillot, the critic who was hired by Ambroise Vollard and Magnac to write a positive review of Picasso's first exhibition at the Galerie Vollard. And this is Picasso's portrait.
Is that allowed? Is that allowed?
You bet. Back in the day, it certainly was. It was part of the practice.
I mean, it was not exhibited at the Galerie Vollard exhibition, but it was painted most probably during the run of that show or immediately thereafter. But yes, he painted a portrait of the man who championed him both in Le Journal and in the introduction to the catalog.
Exactly, and he worked on this painting, after the Vollard show. That what we see, this banquette, was much busier than how it's been simplified now. But it's very interesting. The shirt has that similar tie that we see on our guy here. and this, white shirt, that's in the center. And so, we looked at that. We looked at this painting that's upstairs by called the Diners, that's in the Rhode Island School of Design's Museum of Art. Because the bald pate on this gentleman in the RISD painting is similar to our guy here. But,
Well, also the posu. I think you and I both thought we have in your painting the thinker's pose.
Exactly.
And here in the RISD picture, he also is equally pensive, meaning resting his chin on his hand, engaged in thought in comparison with the courtesan with whom he is in company, who is this.
Exactly. And this thinker's pose, we're looking at a kind of, what, other kinds of similar poses or backdrops do we find? And so this painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art of the seated harlequin, you can see that there's, also a banquette that is behind that figure, but he also has this very stylized hand gesture up against his cheek. And that's not what we're really seeing. That stylization is not what we're really seeing in our painting. And we also, as Patty indicated, this painting that lives at the Israel Museum of the woman with a necklace was the one that we found that was like the closest in approach, composition, gesture, and pose to the gentleman in our painting. And one of the sources for this thinker's pose that has been proposed in the literature is this painting by Gauguin that you see on the bottom of the slide that was, we know it was in the inventory of Ambroise Voillart's gallery, and Picasso would have had opportunity to have seen that painting of Madame Ginoux at the Café at Arles. And she has, this very similar kind of simplification of her form and, this white center, on her chest. And that very kind of stilled, naturalistic idea of the pose, the thinker's pose, as Kenneth mentioned. And we also have brought into this conversation today this image that Harry probably knows this painting very well from all of his time at Harvard, Picasso's Maternity from 1901, that underneath it has a portrait of the critic and poet Max Jacob. And Picasso, Max Jacob, at the time of the Vollard exhibition opening in June of 1901, neither one of them could speak the other's language, but they hit it off anyway. And when Picasso went to visit Jacob in his small apartment, he did this portrait that we see underneath. There's Jacob's face, and John, you probably can explain better about what it is we're seeing here. That's the figure that lies underneath this maternity figure here.
Yes, exactly. It's one of the product images we make from the hyperspectral data that we collected, that Patty showed. We get these vignettes or views, this one emphasizing him more than the final composition. It's kind of interesting you say that, because I have another image that comes out of the processing that shows a pipe that looks like an interior of a room going to a heater or a small stove, which then makes sense.
Exactly. And, but it's, he took a different approach when he did this portrait of Max Jacob in his personal environment on the floor, surrounded by his books. And so it's different than our portrait, that shows our gentleman as if he's out in Montmartre in one of these night cafes. But Patty has noticed something very interesting, and I'll let her speak to this, about the image here.
Yeah, just more of those drip marks that you can, again, and well, also the hatching that we see, this is in the, over the painting of the mother and child, there's hatching up in the drapery as well, but we see these fluid drip marks. So he's thinning his paint, he's sketching in paint, working up that composition with thin paint, working it up quickly, not really caring about the drip marks, and because he'll come back and paint over them.
And then this is the last slide I'm going to show. Harry, here, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Are we seeing a small female head as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
I don't know what that's about. That's
'Cause
so interesting, isn't
This
it?
is a better image than I've ever seen, and I thought it was just the Max Jacob. So,
This is,
And stratigraphically, John, do you think that this woman who is in profile above Jacob,
oh, yeah.
yeah, you need,
stratigraphically, John, based on the image you've been able to generate, does she sit? Is she on top of, or do we know?
I don't think we know for sure. I suspect she's underneath, but
Okay.
but similar materials, but it's essentially a lot of the black pigment. But it is true, Harry, this is kind of surprising when she popped out when we first started looking at the data.
So it's three paintings in one,
Yes.
at least.
At
Yes.
least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and I'm just going to toss this in because, an X-ray of this painting at Harvard has lived, and been published and discussed. But this John's new imaging has revealed additional information that, as we've kind of been suggesting here, kind of complicates what we understand and see on this canvas. And wondering, has been suggested, is this like, on top of, underneath, where does this figure originate in the kind of layering of the images on this particular canvas?
And it's also just wonderful to see Picasso's drawing, which gets hidden in the thick, blue period painting, but you see it so beautifully there, like an old master drawing.
Exactly. Exactly, because Picasso was academically trained. That was part of his background. And so I want this as my last discussion slide on the Blue Room, because I love this comparison, John's image of the overlay of the Blue Room in false color on top of the portrait. I use this, I point this out when I do tours in the gallery because it so clearly speaks to this amazing practice that you see. He turns the canvas 90 degrees counterclockwise, and he creates this very complex composition directly on top of the portrait. And what we learned from Patty's research is that all of this texture that has been assigned in the literature to the Blue Room as being something that Picasso labored over, we learned through Patty's studies that the Blue Room is very thinly painted on top of that portrait, and all of the texture is the portrait. And so Picasso worked very quickly and rapidly to paint this very elaborate composition, a mise-en-scène, like a stage set on top of that portrait. And you see, this, you get some idea of like what it had to be in his mind's eye, what he knew he was doing. And as Patty said, there are we don't have any preliminary drawings for the Blue Room. So this was just something that, his friend, his childhood, his friend, Jomi Sobartes, talks about in his memoir about watching Picasso paint, and then it was like he was a hypnotized individual that was just solely focused on, the canvas in front of him, and, knew what he was doing. And so I just think that this particular image that John has put together for us really illustrates so much of how that practice really played out in this particular painting, which because of our knowledge that the portrait was dry when the Blue Room was painted, and we have been able to date that portrait of the unknown gentleman to perhaps July of 1901, about the time that the Israel picture was painted. Patty has assured me that it takes about 4 months for the paint to dry. And so it really pushes the dating of our painting further into the fall of 1901. So it's, perhaps around the end of October, at the time of Picasso's 20th birthday, October 25th, or even into November. So it really kind of changes, even how we might consider what this canvas meant to him and where it kind of fits into that moment.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, of course.
Just in terms of it being so thinly painted. You'll hear later about Picasso incorporating elements of an underlying composition into the later composition, and we don't see that with this picture, although we really wanted to. But what he does incorporate is the color from the underlying picture. And if you look at the painting in the gallery, especially on the bed, with the texture that's underneath and this dry brush skipping over that texture, it adds to the light and the color on the bed. So he's still doing that. But this one's unique because he's not working it again and getting that thick surface that we see later in some of the later Blue Period pictures.
Right. All right, John, you're on.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the paintings at the gallery, the Gourmet. So these are some of the images that come from the rather traditional methods, looking for compositional changes or paintings underneath. X-radiograph, which is measuring the amount of X-ray absorbing materials. You're doing transmission, much like you'd go get an X-ray at the doctor's. And in this case, lead white shows up very strongly, vermilion. In the other case, we use infrared reflectography, which is a fancy way of saying taking a picture in the infrared. In the infrared is the region beyond the red that we see, but it's not the infrared that we call the thermal, which is where we see objects that emit heat. So the images you see of people running around, thermal emission from them at night, we're not quite that far in the infrared. We're in a magical place where you're actually able to penetrate the paint layers and get light reflected off of the ground, preparation ground. And if there's a black absorbing pigment, an infrared absorbing pigment, like carbon black, you'll actually see that. And that's how you see these drawings, old master drawings underneath paintings that Harry was mentioning. And so in this picture here of the Gourmet, you can see there's a woman underneath. The question is, in the late 90s, associated with the exhibitions of that time period, we're finding these Blue Period paintings and changes. The questions that happen today, as Patty illustrates, is people want to know, is it by Picasso? Was it finished? And if it was finished, what are the colors that were there in that composition? The trick is to do it without taking samples everywhere. People get upset about that. So we've been working, though it is the gold standard, it's the only way really to know. We and other laboratories have been working on using techniques developed for remote sensing of the Earth, and used quite a bit now by NASA and other institutions to study the planets like Mars, to map and identify materials. Particularly there, they want to know minerals that form in aqueous conditions. To use that technology to look at the paintings, which are made up by pigments, many oftentimes minerals themselves, and use that technique to map materials, and especially to penetrate in the infrared into the lower layers. So I'm showing you a picture in the middle here. If I do this right, oops. Which is just an optimal picture showing the woman underneath. We don't have a just position, though you can still see there's some problems with the little boy showing up. And the picture looks very flat, kind of looks more like a drawing. With some mathematical processing, we end up with a picture on the far right, which really shows a sense of what I would say three-dimensionality to the woman. She looks more like finished. This is directly related to the pigment lead white, specifically basic lead white. And one of the things that pops up also is a necklace, which is actually kind of surprising in my understanding for Picasso. But in any ways, this is getting a lot closer. Now there is another way to do this, which is not with reflected light, as Patty mentioned, but to use a technique that maps elements maps lead, maps vermilion, which would, through the presence of mercury, you could infer the presence of a chrome-based pigment from a chromium map. And this technique, which started off being developed in synchrotrons, so very fancy, super expensive instrumentation where you had to take a painting, suddenly got miniaturized to come to a laboratory. So we can build this in our own lab, the National Gallery. This is an instrument we put together to do the scanning. And out comes some maps. One of the things that was disappointing is we weren't able to see the woman underneath in the lead, and then it has to do with the chemistry of the interaction. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is you need all of these different forms of imaging to build up the composition. What we did get out of this was the lower example there showing chromium is present in the necklace. So that could be chrome yellow and essentially give rise to the gold necklace. And so that's what we have basically of an idea now. It's a woman with a white mantilla and a gold necklace. And I think I'll leave it there for the team to talk.
Okay, I'm just gonna, this is just kind of, we're gonna be riffing here about what we see underneath this painting. So we put together some slides that contextualize this image underneath Le Gourmet. And we know that Picasso in 1899, he did this portrait of his sister that she's wearing a black mantilla. And she's looking out at us. And then in the gallery upstairs, we have this portrait of his sister Lola that she again is looking out at us. But one of the things that struck me in this image of the woman in the white mantilla is that she has, her eyes are rather downcast. She's not looking out at us. I'm still, kind of trying to figure out when Picasso would have done this. The gold necklace of the cross around her neck makes her very Spanish. There's a painting that Picasso did the following year in Barcelona of the wife of a friend, and she has a white shawl on, and her necklace of a gold necklace with a cross is clearly visible. But when Kenneth and I were kind of ruminating about this painting, we associated with the kind of manner of the application of paint with the way that the headdress on this child was painted, given the title The Sun King in the Volar exhibition. And also upstairs in the gallery, we have this painting of the Spanish dancer and this kind of broken brushwork that you see, behind her, that may be, her a hat that she's wearing.
Well, this is also the question you and I were talking about, Sue, when we were wondering when in 1901 would this have been painted. And what's most salient for me when we compare the woman with the mantilla underneath Le Gourmet and the Spanish dancer, which for everyone's knowledge was exhibited as El Tango in the Volar exhibition. And the question I have is, and Sue also has, is the woman in a mantilla, is this an exoticizing depiction of a version of Spanishness that might appeal to Parisian taste? Just as when you look at El Tango, or the Spanish dancer, you see that this is a very stereotyped flamenco dancer. But when you compare the two works, in addition to the neo-impressionist bricks with which the mantilla is composed and the background of the Spanish dancer, I noticed that the Spanish dancer has that gold bracelet, just as we have the chromium-based cross in the mantilla, but in El Tango, you see that bracelet, and it does lead, and this is like an exchange Sue and I had during one of our many telephone conversations, this focus on some kind of appurtenance to signify Spanishness. Does it indicate that maybe that the woman in the mantilla, was this a painting for the Volar exhibition that was maybe set aside?
Right. I mean, we don't have the answers for all these questions. They just, raise possibilities that, are there to be explored further. And then, we have the example of the woman in a white mantilla that you see in the center of the screen that Picasso told his friend Pierre Dex when Dex was putting together the catalogue raisonné on the blue and rose period, that this painting in Woman in a White Mantilla was not a 1905-06 painting, it was a 1901 painting that he did at the time that he was doing the maternities. So, it brings the painting underneath Le Gourmet, into conversation with this other painting that is known. And Kenneth and I just thought, we'll throw this in because we're trying to context these works, is that Picasso, when he was in Madrid studying at the Royal Academy and spending his time at the Prado, was very taken with these sorrowing virgins of Titian. That there are two of them in the collection of the Prado, and this one here, the Virgin has, the essence of a mantilla, on her head. And so wondering if, it just re-emphasizes the Spanishness of this painting and the subject of it.
Well, also, Sue, you mentioned this earlier with the portraits of Lola. Both of those portraits of Lola, a known person, a known subject, she gazes at the spectator.
Right.
Her gaze is theatricalizing. Whereas, here we have these downcast eyes. And, my question is, is this a portrait, or I look at the arc of the eyebrow, I look at the arc of the other eyebrow that leads to the ridge of the nose, and are these just formulaic devices, and is this a type, or is this an individual? Right. Is this meant to be, and this is why I really enjoy your comparison to the Titian, is she meant just to be a sorrowful woman, or a sorrowful, or is she meant to evoke the sorrows of the Virgin Mary? Is she meant to just be a religious type?
Exactly, and we have a colleague in Barcelona, Edward Valles, who is the chief curator of modern art at the National Museum of Catalan Art in Barcelona, and he is very much immersed in this blue period of Picasso's work, and he suggested in correspondence with John, I believe, that it could be related to Picasso's engagement with Saint-Lazare. And so we have put together an image of a woman from Saint-Lazare that is on the right on the screen.
So you should tell everyone what Saint-Lazare is.
Oh yes, I have to do that. That's a good point. Saint-Lazare was a women's prison in Paris, had been a prison for several hundred years, and at the end of the French Revolution it became specifically a prison for women, and it was women who were guilty of petty crimes, but also women who violated the laws about prostitution. And so there were, when these women were brought in to be processed, they would be tested for venereal disease, and if they were positive for venereal disease, then they would be required to stay at the prison for treatment over a series of months. And so Saint-Lazare became a very well-known prison that in the 19th century, even the United States saw it as being very progressive in the way that it had a hospital and treatment for women who were ill with venereal diseases. And so Picasso spent time at Saint-Lazare in the late summer, early fall of 1901. He's not the first artist to have spent time or been interested in the inmates of Saint-Lazare, but it altered his, it brought awareness to him of the challenges that faced women who were living on the margins of society, living in poverty, and in a way that he had not been willing to acknowledge, if you will, as a 19-year-old young man in Paris, enjoying himself. And so he began to do images related to the women incarcerated at Saint-Lazare. And we have 4 of them upstairs in the exhibition. And they become increasingly anonymous figures. And the cap that these women were required to wear while at Saint Lazare is more like this cap that this woman here wears. And she seems more specific than anonymous, but she lives under this portrait that you see on the upper right. That is a late portrait from the end of 1901 of Picasso's friend Jomis Barthes. And so it's just interesting to kind of compare these 2 images because this painting was likely done, perhaps the end of the summer, early fall 1901. I'm just going to move forward because, I don't want to take up too much more time, but this is just images of Saint Lazare that, were taken in the early part of the 20th century. But you see, it was the nuns. There was a particular order of nuns that was in charge of administering Saint Lazare. And so here is an image from the laundry of the inmates. They all had either a cap and a shawl around them and an apron. So there was a kind of uniform that they wore. And that you see that here in this one of in the refectory, the nuns, of course, have a large cross that they're wearing on their habit. And so we just go back now to thinking about Le Gourmet. I mean, I don't have, I just have questions now about when, Le Gourmet may have been painted. It's just a much more complicated, canvas than, previously, thought about. And, this, this child eating out of a very, fancy bowl, attired with these shoes and socks, very nicely coiffed, not a poverty-stricken child at all, and we're just comparing it here to the image of this child who's wearing this pair of boots and this fancy little dress and has her doll in her arm. And Le Gourmet has been compared to the posters of the illustrations of Theophil Steinlen. You see this one here that has been suggested as a possible source. I
mean, it's interesting you compare these two because with Le Gourmet, I mean, you do have the bourgeois child placed in the center of the composition, but the brushwork is just so radically different. And even the reduction of the composition to a set of interlocking curvilinear shapes in the Chesterdale painting in Le Gourmet, it's worlds away from the Sun King, which was exhibited in Picasso's first exhibition in Paris at the Galerie Vollard, June 24th to July 14th.
Right.
So, obviously this more cloisonniste, we call it cloisonniste because they have these interlocking shapes outlined by thick contours, most definitely postdates it. When I look at the Steinlen and in Le Gourmet, it's that forelock with the curl. Mm-hmm. I mean, you cannot help but notice the similarities between the forelock with the curls of both
this
girls.
Curl here and this, curl that you see here.
But I wonder when you show the next slide, Sue.
Yes, this is the one that's so interesting. And I know Patty picked up on a number of things. Kenneth, you and I picked up on some things. And, Harry, you may pick up on some things here too. That, just the kind of, brushwork, the approach, it has certain similarities. Patty, did you have any?
I was wondering, do you know how big this mother and child?
Harry,
can you? It's pretty big. It's bigger than Le Gourmet.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'm remembering.
What also I notice, the ruddy cheeks. I was noticing the ruddy cheeks in Le Gourmet, and in these 1901 paintings and the Saint Lazare pictures, the women do not have ruddy cheeks.
No.
But in the painting from Israel, she has
ruddy cheeks. Yes, exactly.
It's just something to think of.
I know. See, it's just.
It's interesting to me to see these. I have curated both of these paintings, never thought about them together. But I'm looking at this sort of mountainous landscape that you get, that sort of horizon through the middle or even lower down there where it picks up the knee, and you know, also in the Gourmet, it's this wave-like, very dynamic composition.
Yes.
But I hadn't thought of them together. I actually, with Le Gourmet, I've borrowed a Toulouse-Lautrec from the West Building to show that, because I think there's a lot of Lautrec in Le Gourmet, in the draperies and the and how the color, beautiful color, comes into the draperies, which you don't get in the Blue Period Mother and Child, but you do get a similar, more schematic way of handling the draperies with those highlights.
Yes.
Right.
And it's the same artist and very direct line.
Well, this is the question Sue and I have. Given, you know, all the similarities you just outlined, Sue and I mean, curating this exhibition, I think it became abundantly clear when we were especially dealing with the Saint-Lazare paintings, of which the Harvard picture is one, that these were paintings Picasso could not sell. And we know that toward the end of 1901, he and Magnac, his agent, the person who arranged for the Vollard exhibition, Picasso was living with Magnac, they were reaching this impasse because these pictures, the mother and child from Harvard being one, could not sell. The painting from Detroit in our exhibition did not sell until Gertrude Stein purchased it. So was Picasso, and this is a question that Sue and I threw at one another during a telephone conversation, was that maybe just his attempt to maybe throw a bone at Magnac, meaning, you know, I'm still going to paint in the style of the Saint-Lazare women that you detest, but I'll give you a very, you know, bourgeois vignette that might be marketable.
So reaching back to his Lautrec, more colorful, more sort of entertaining style, perhaps.
A compromise formation, right?
Uh-huh.
You know, here, I'm not going to change my style, but I'll go back to the Vollard subject matter.
Yeah.
But the provenance on Le Gourmet, you know, it doesn't go through Burt Weil or anything. It just stays with Picasso. It never, like the Blue Room, the provenance on the Blue Room, Magnac took possession of the Blue Room when the two went their separate ways. And he included the Blue Room in the first exhibition he organized in 1902 in Paris with Burt Weil. And that's when he gave our painting the title Le Tube. And so then our painting had a kind of, you know, varied path before it ended up with Wilhelm Uda. But it appears that Le Gourmet probably got packed up and left with a friend because Magnac didn't want it.
Or he couldn't get his hands on it.
Even though he is wearing those patent leather shoes with the shine.
Exactly.
Which my eye always goes right to that. It's so well done.
I know, exactly. It is, isn't it? I know. It's just
doesn't
like,
quite, kind of pops out a little, doesn't maybe quite fit. Maybe that was the little bit of shine that needed to be put on the painting for the market.
It's an appurtenance of bourgeois, you know, of class status. So of course you would direct everyone's attention to the fetish object.
all right, I'm going to move us
The
on.
shine. You want to get into Freud?
I'm going to
The shine
move
on
us
the
on
nose.
to John talking about this painting that lives at the Pola Art Museum in Japan.
And
That
I
he
will,
went to Japan to image.
right, with Sandra.
And with Kenneth and Sandra. You know, they were like a trio making this trip to Japan together. That's why we have 5 loans from Japan in the exhibition upstairs, is because of these 3 individuals right here. And Kenneth's amazing, you know, ability to kind of think strategically about how to kind of, you know, open the door to getting these loans to Japan.
We had to do it. Japan has 5 major early Picassos, and I think to mount an exhibition on this topic, you know, one has to cultivate relationships with one's Japanese colleagues by virtue of the fact that these were popular paintings that were collected aggressively in the post-war era in Japan when those major collections, which are now municipal museums, or in the case of the Polo Museum, a private museum in Hakone, but those collectors in the 50s, 60s, and 70s made a concerted effort to collect early Picasso.
Okay, John, you're
Okay.
on.
So the Mother and Child by the Sea, the first X-ray and infrared reflectorama of this painting was taken at the National Gallery for the Picasso exhibition titled Picasso, the Early Years. So it would have been the 90s. The X-radiograph you see on the right-hand side was taken in 2005 by the Tokyo National Research Institute for Cultural Properties. And it's a fabulous X-ray radiograph, and it reveals a couple of things. Of course, you see the hidden female figure, but actually the reason why it's flipped is at the bottom there's actually a signature saying, which leads you to believe there's an earlier version on the painting. Okay. The image in the middle is a composite. We went basically to Japan to try to see if we could learn more about this woman underneath. And in the process, we learned more about maybe the room around her rather than the hidden woman herself. And you can see sort of a banquette in the background behind her that she's sitting in, and we see those slashes or zigzags of paint that Patty's been referring to. But perhaps the most exciting thing, oh, I'm sorry, there we go, there's the signature.
Which way is up for the X-rays?
Oh, so what we understand, Harry, so where John, the slide where you see the arrow pointing toward the dash Picasso dash underline, we understand that there is another composition, so that is rotated 180 degrees.
From the final paint.
Right, so that's number 3.
Yeah.
So we understand that there are at least 2 compositions underneath the surface composition because of that signature that you only see when you rotate the canvas 180 degrees. Hyphen Picasso hyphen, and we call that the Villar signature because that's the signature he codified before the Villar exhibition in June '01.
Yeah. So I think the other woman is like up here in the corner.
Right. It would be if I can borrow your. It would be there.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
There's also a face in the lower right-hand corner.
Right. So there's one more to go after.
Yeah. Exactly.
However, I think the thing that jumped out immediately when we started looking at the data, the raw data that came in as we started collecting with a hyperspectral camera, was what you can see in a false color there, which is this newspaper print, which is reversed. The language is French. And I think that stopped us all cold. It's pretty funny because when you do this type of work, you put something up on the painting that people are comfortable with to focus the camera. And of course, we use some sort of text. So to see text on a painting is always a very strange thing.
Can you laser point that for us?
Yeah, I'll go in a little closer in a moment.
Yeah.
So here's a detail even closer. Keiko Ima, who's the chief curator at the museum, that evening went home and started to look for the possible newspaper and maybe the edition from which this print had been transferred, or if the paper was actually inside or actually used for the painting itself. But anyway, she found pretty quickly that it dated to Le Journal, specifically to January 18th, and not only that, to a particular page, page 3, by looking at the matching up. So there is in the middle there a detail of the actual newspaper, and you can actually read several of the letters and sort of piece this back together again. So in the process of looking at different parts of the painting from the infrared that we collected, it was determined that 2 pages from the newspaper were used to, quote, would cover the entire painting. Now, the realization was that there was no physical evidence that the paper had been incorporated into the painting, though you might imagine Picasso could do or would do such a thing. In this case, it looks like it was simply a transfer process that was validated by another conservator at Reyes in Barcelona at the museum. But beyond that observation, Keiko and colleagues like Sandra and Reyes began to look to see if there were other paintings at that time period that he might have been also doing the same thing to. Because what was interesting is the key question, and that I understand it, is when did this painting of the mother and child come to Barcelona. It was when he was leaving Paris at the end of 1901, early 1902. And the question came, when was this painting finished, in Barcelona, or was it finished in advance? So in the context of that, two other paintings, one that we've seen before of Sabates, and this other one of his friend, Picasso's friend De Soto, there are examples of the same print, newsprint, transferred onto the paintings. And actually, they were able to trace it down to be from the same edition, just different pages. I think I got that right.
Well, for the two paintings, for Sabates and Woman and Child by the Mother and Child by the Sea, it is the same. It is the same pages, but it's a different newspaper for the portrait of De Soto.
Thank
It's
you.
January 9th.
January 9th, okay.
So, but there is a story from Sabates that the three traveled together early in January. So what is particularly significant about this is that if the date of the Le Journal is January 18th, then it couldn't have been the beginning of the month. So it adjusted that, the understanding of when they actually returned to Barcelona.
Well, I mean, for Picasso scholars, and especially for me and Sue, and we'll discuss this in our next section, but there was no agreement in the literature, even when we read Richardson. Richardson is the biographer, his volume 1, which is available in the bookstore here at the Phillips collection for purchase. You will. Richardson has no idea when Picasso returned to Barcelona in early '02, but with Keiko's research, with your research, John, and with your research, Sandra, the paper you all co-authored, we now have a terminus post quem for when he left, a date after which that he left Paris. We have this January 18th date, which also asks an important question that we'll elaborate soon, but at least now we have empirical evidence that gives us a date after which he must have left Paris. But I guess there's also this question about why would you wrap paper? I know you have opinions on this areas.
Well, just a thought, but if we could go back a couple of slides, I'm not sure people saw in The Woman by the Sea where the imprint is, and it's,
Oh, yes.
it's actually nicely visible. So, yes,
That's
right?
what I wanted. Yep.
And even one more before that, possibly? No, I guess not, yeah. So
Go on.
right on her face, right?
It's
where-
on the-
where
yeah.
the white paint really has picked up.
It's all in the white paint areas.
Yeah.
Not too surprising, I suppose.
Right, and the idea is that, if I'm not mistaken, the paint must have been not completely dry in order to pick up the newsprint.
Reyes
Correct.
Jimenez Garnica at the Museo Picasso Barcelona, for your paper, she performed a test, actually, to test if the ink would transfer on wet oil paint. I mean, I guess this was part of the process of you writing your scientific paper, was to understand
Right.
how this transfer occurred.
My understanding is this is not an uncommon thing for painters to do, per se, to use.
Right, it reminded me of a case of de Kooning, and I went to the MoMA website, I think, where there's a note that, and this was their interpretation, that it was de Kooning's practice to cover a wet painting with newspaper in order to slow the drying time, to kind of protect it from air, so that, because de Kooning loved to work a wet painting and keep working it. So I don't know if it's to slow the drying time, or in this case to help it to dry, absorb oils. Maybe is it to wrap it for transport? I think that was one of your ideas.
Yeah.
I don't.
Kooning's paper in intimate contact with the painting?
Well, the painting, just like here, it picks up a really legible imprint of the paper. Yeah.
I don't want to throw a wrench into this, but I was wondering if, Sandra, what do you think about this? Because there's a practice in mid-19th century in France even of facing paintings. So if he's transporting this, would he have actually adhered the newspaper as a facing onto the surface of the paint to transport it? Do you know what I mean? Talking about? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
To protect the paint itself.
Yeah, so like using a glue or a wax or something to adhere the newsprint over the surface, over the paint surface, just to protect it and to hold everything in place while he's transporting it. I'm just wondering if that might, I guess you would have to look on the surface for any residues of the glue or something.
I think what's interesting here is it's the oil, so the pigment of actually the newsprint itself being transferred across.
But if these things would do that, if you're using a newspaper, I think, because you'd put the newspaper onto the surface of the painting, then you would, brush a varnish or a glue or a wax over that newsprint, just like you might see in churches in Europe with the paper.
Sure.
And that
glued
could
to
have
the
been done
surface.
to a very dry painting. But then the act of adhering the newsprint to it might have created the transfer.
Just
Yeah.
to complicate things.
But,
Just-
I mean,
The test that we did involved dry paper and wet paper. And there was ink transfer using both. And, we know that it was intimately attached because of some of the records, some of the later treatment in 1971 shows that there was paper still stuck to the surface. It wasn't all removed.
See, I think this is so fascinating because if you see this painting in the gallery, these transferred images are not really visible to the naked eye. And they were at one time. It's our understanding that when Picasso arrived in Barcelona and ultimately made a gift of this painting, you can see the inscription in the top left, to Dr. Joseph Fontbona. The Fontbona family, held this painting for decades, and they spoke to Reyes and in Barcelona, and they remember seeing these ghost words, if you will, on the surface of the painting. And so it's a fascinating thing that he did not paint that out, that he left it. And so, and I'm going to pitch this question to Harry because of his knowledge about Cubist Picasso and this idea about words on the surface.
Right, and in fact, Le Journal is the newspaper that you see in tons of Cubist collages, whether it's Picasso or Braque or Gris. It's even one of the Phillips, I believe. And that was a kind of sort of lowbrow newspaper that they love to read and cut up. So is this the birth of collage cubism? I think not. I think that would be a little bit sort of Sunday quarterbacking. But it's very interesting that Picasso, did that and didn't correct it. I think, for me, the relationship to Cubism is, it's really a matter of great contrast to begin with, because Cubist paintings, and we've got paintings in collages, and I don't want to get too far into it, but the paintings are very thin, and they're not painted over other paintings. There's none of that working and reworking of paintings. But and that's analytic cubism. But when you get to collage and this invention by Braque and then Picasso of putting papers and wallpapers and pieces of music and newsprint together, and that wasn't happening for them on canvas. So it's really only Gris that's doing it on canvas. They're doing it paper on paper. But there you certainly have a practice which is all about layering things, and one thing overlapping another thing, and one thing hiding another thing. And Rosalind Krauss has written about that and interpreted that in terms of the play of signs and how one sign replaces another. And that, I think, in a kind of more general way, certainly makes me think about an artist who maybe a decade ago or less was constantly repainting and replacing and covering one one thing with another. So maybe there is something of a collage aspect, not having to do with le journal, I think, but having to do with this a basic principle of this hide and seek, of this covering and revealing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my thought on Cubism, and you know, much as I would like to say, there's Le Journal, we have the birth of Cubism.
You know, I mean, what's fascinating is I think that was on the table for some people when this information first surfaced for maybe 5 minutes, but
Yeah.
you know, it was shelved.
Yes.
It was shelved. So, I mean, my question is, I mean, you know, Sue, you're in charge of the program. Do you want to discuss these 3 paintings going to Barcelona, or should we move to our next
I
section?
think we need to move on because we have like a half an hour of conversation discussion left before we get the Q&A. So I think for you and Sandra to kind of take the floor now to go and quickly go through the 2 paintings that are in the exhibition upstairs.
So can everybody hear me? You can't hear me?
You have to put it
I'm going to speak right into it.
Okay. Okay, I'll get it. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the team of scientists with whom we worked on our Blue Period paintings. We were grateful to be able to access the program at Northwestern University Art Institute of Chicago Center for Studies in the Arts. And of course, we were grateful to be able to bring John Delaney from the National Gallery. Picasso's Crouching Beggar Woman was acquired by the AGO in 1963. And for a very long time, we knew that there were secrets lying beneath the surface. On the left, in the area of the woman's right shoulder, you can see the details on the right. There's unrelated paint texture in the surface, unrelated to the final composition, and there's color peeking through that also doesn't really relate to the final composition. I think in the upper right, you'll see some linear white peeking through, and then in the lower corner, oops, you can see an arc of.
You have to do it on the
Just
screen.
to do it up here, I'll get it yet. So that you can see an arc of white. And in 1992, the Conservation Department had carried out X-ray radiography. And as you can see, when the painting is rotated counterclockwise, there's an underlying landscape. And what is particularly interesting to us is how Picasso fitted the back of the figure into the high profile of the hills in the underlying work. And Kenneth, in consultation with colleagues in Barcelona, recently identified the garden, the painting. It's a labyrinth garden that's still in existence in Horta on the edge of Barcelona. And here is John Delaney in Toronto in the Conservation Department collecting hundreds of reflectance spectra and generating the beautiful hyperspectral image cube that you see in the lower left. And from that, he generated this remarkable false color infrared reflectance image that you see in the middle. It has revealed many interesting details about the painting. Pardon? Yeah. And most dramatically in the area of over her right shoulder. And I think if you look closely, you might be able to imagine that it's an uplifted right arm with fingers overlapping a circular disc that we think is red, typical of the style of the period. And I've included a watercolor by Picasso just to help you visualize this really unusual pose. So these are details of the area. You can see on the left, it's the area that's where the disfigurement, in a sense, is still peeking through. That's what you see with the naked eye today. It wasn't covered up by Picasso. And the one in the middle gives you a little more detail about the finger forms. I think if you look carefully, you can count 6 fingers. On the right, John has provided an enhanced image with PCA analysis in black and white, so you see the outline and you can count the many fingers. So it shows us how Picasso has changed the positioning of the fingers in the chronology of painting. So we had a lot of information about the underlying forms, and we wanted to know more about the pigments that were involved. So here is Emmeline Pouillet, who has come from Northwestern University, and she has a little X-ray fluorescent scanner, an ELIO device mounted on a gantry that is able to scan over the surface of the painting in a very controlled manner. And it collects a characteristic fluorescence when the small amount of X-ray is emitted. And from that, these elemental maps are created. And for these elements, they may be key elements in a particular pigment, and so it delineates the distribution of the pigment over the painting. And sometimes you can see distinct brush strokes. So I wanted to pull out 2 in particular that I think are particularly interesting. Here you can see with the cadmium elemental map on the left that Picasso first painted the woman with her shroud exposing the uplifted right arm. And then he completes the painting with a chromium-based pigment and completely covers the figure. And this slide shows the complementary X-ray fluorescence detail. You can see in the upper right, you can see the fingers, but it's a map for lead. You can see that the one finger is black. You can see perhaps it was painted then in zinc white. And in the lower right, you can see the elemental map for iron, which infers Prussian blue. So in the outlining, you can see how Picasso developed the contours of the fingers. Really remarkable insights into the process of painting and the artist's creative process.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. So we will briefly discuss the ramifications of the study, what we were able to glean art historically from these investigations. And our first order of business when, everyone can hear me? Yes? Our first order of business, Sue, Sandra, and I, Patty, when we were presented in 2014, when Sandra shared the 1992 X-radiograph with us, we had no idea what to do with this landscape. We have this rounded classicizing temple, and I felt my first instinct was to try to search the Mediterranean for this landscape, and I was not having luck. I was performing random Google searches for any coastal city in Italy and Spain, and I could not find this site. And so Sue and I just thought, maybe this is just a capriccio. It's an imagined site, and our first impulse was to look at Pierre Puvis de Chavannes and Joaquin Torres Garcia, who was working in the manner of Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. And you can see we have the cover of Peloplomas, who directed my attention, as did Marlene Gual at the Museo Picasso Barcelona, to this July 1, 1901 cover. And Sue and I, during one of our many visits to the Catalan National Museum, stumbled on this Joaquin Torres Garcia, and we were convinced for a month or two that perhaps maybe Joaquin Torres Garcia painted the landscape, or Picasso was working in the manner of Joaquin Torres Garcia, or maybe it was some other Barcelona artist who was responding to Puvis in 1901. But because Sue and I were, and Sue, I think this was really, this was a real revelation for both of us. We visit Josep de Silaplana. He is the scholar of record of the Barcelona Modernista, Santiago Rusiñol, author of the Catalogue Raisonné, a three-volume text. And Sue and I arrive, and we're there to negotiate a loan, and we show Josep Laplana, who is also, he is a priest. He's lived in a monastery on the hill of Montserrat for 40 years. We show him the X-ray, and his response was, "Oh, that's the Parc de l'Arbre de Horta, obviously." You know, and here's Sue and I, right? And so then our next order of business was to determine why this site is significant. So what we've done here for you is, you see this photograph by Claudie Carbonaflot, but more importantly, and Sue was the one to find this online, this photograph of Utrillo and Maragall. And here they stage a performance of Goethe in the Parc de l'Arbre de Horta in October 1898. You see the classicizing temple is festooned with all this bunting. And what we know is that the symbolist current of the Barcelona Modernistas really celebrated this site, and they had exclusive access to it because they happened to be friends with the owner, the Marquis d'Alfarràs, who granted them access. This was a private park. The public did not have access to this site. But then you see in this photograph, this more sepia-type photograph in Palaploma, you see that that's the Marquis d'Alfarràs's photograph of his garden. And this article that was published to accompany this, and Sue, you were in the library at the Museo Picasso Barcelona, and I remember I was at the Calferat, and then I came and I found you, and you were saying, "Kenneth, you have to read this article in Catalan, it's on the site." And then when you read the article, what you realize is that these Barcelona Modernistas, Utrillo, Maragall, Rossinyol, Joaquim Mir, others, they celebrated this site. And if you think earlier when Sue and I thought it was a capriccio, but then we realized it's a real site. Well, the fact that it's not just a real site, but this was a site that they interpreted as a vestige of a Spain untainted by modernity. This was an 18th century garden that signified a pristine past untouched by the machine. And so these modernistas, symbolist modernistas, who were very nostalgic for a pre-industrialized past, would visit this site in order to absorb the original lyrical energies of this untainted nature. So this makes this a very significant site. So what Sue and I then went about doing, we wanted to know, well, who painted it? So these are 3 extant representations of the Parc de l'Arbre de Horta. You see Santiago Rossinyol painted the actual labyrinth and the reflecting pool within the labyrinth, just below the temple, depicted in the landscape underneath La Misereuse Accroupie, the crouching beggar woman. Joaquim Mir paints another area of the park, but Mir and Rossinyol, both modernistas, painted the site. But as Sandra mentioned, what was really significant for us is the fact that Picasso brings literally the form of this underlying symbolist landscape into the surface composition by allowing the ridge of the hills to determine the placement of the contour, the undulating contour of the crouching beggar woman's back. So very briefly, and I guess Sue, if you need to interrupt me, please do, but what Sue and I were able to do with this information, and you were discussing Keiko earlier and her painting and her analysis and the fact that we had that January 18th date. Well, Sue and I realized with Keiko's information and what we were dealing with here is that the exposed arm that Sandra and others exposed really related to Picasso's engagement with Nonel's drawings in Palaploma. We know he saw those. We thought that he might have seen the gypsy women that he exhibited at the Sala Perez, which closed January 17th, but with Keiko's information, we know that was impossible. So what Sue and I had to do is situate this exposed arm in relation to these narrativizing, expressive realist devices that Nonet would freight his figures with in order to signify their poverty, to signify their rural-born status, to signify the fact that these are impoverished women that one would encounter in the suburbs of Barcelona. And certainly Picasso felt obligated when he was in Barcelona to engage with these narrativizing devices of poverty, but he rejected them, as Sandra explained. And and you see also, and this was why Sue was at the library uncovering the Pella Ploma article, and I was at the Cow Ferrat harassing them for their El Greco, which we had in Ontario. But,
You were just having a good time in Cow Ferrat.
yes, I know, such as, it wasn't summer though, unfortunately. But you see also this arm relates to the El Greco, and you see the silhouette also. And so, but what Sue and I were able to do is, we see that this Rossignol style landscape is what really Picasso wanted to emphasize by bringing forward the contour. And he engages with Nonel, but rejects Nonel for Rossignol again. And you look at the Crouching Beggar Woman, and you see that what Picasso, by covering that arm, what he really wants us to focus on is her suffering, the enclosed gesture of her suffering, her remoteness, the downcast eyes that are shuttered, the bowed head, but also the mantilla and her I would say her saintly garb that makes her into a saint. And so it's more of the religious significance of this impoverished beggar woman. It is conflation of, a Saint Mary, a Mary Magdalene, or a suffering virgin with this impoverished woman, and not so much her poverty, not so much her ordinariness as Nonel wants us to see, but instead these more symbolist evocative aspects of the Crouching Beggar Woman. So I think that's what the technical analysis helped us do. Sue, do you feel I omitted anything?
No, I think you've covered it very well. And I think we want to keep moving forward, so we want to go to the soup.
So the soup, or La Soupe, is a small but monumental painting in the collection of the AGO. It was painted at the height of Picasso's blue period, 1903, and it's almost monochromatic blue. It's has a very complex surface. The brushstrokes are very distinct. We took a paint sample from the middle right side and observed 13 separate layers of paint to give you some idea of the thickness and complexity. And in the lower right of the painting, over the woman's legs, there's a hard-edged circular depression. And conservators thought early on that it really related to a scraped-down earlier version, a paint that was dry, and then it's left this very hard-edged depression. And this is documented very well in the X-radiograph. All that dark area where there's no paint, you can see the grid of the canvas exposed, and the other dark areas show where paint has been scraped away before Picasso painted the next version. On the right, you see the the false color infrared reflectance image provided by John Delaney. And I've outlined between the two figures what may be a figure of another woman looking away. Her back is to us. She may be reaching back for another child. I need the pointer, please. And this is another version of a false color image. And I think that you can see between the two figures, you can see this. We were very surprised to see this vessel emerge. It's kind of related to nothing. It had no apparent relationship to the surface image. And I think if you look closely behind the head of the girl, you can see the head of another child, and then there's a ghost of another foot behind her lifted foot. So again, we had lots of interesting information about other forms, and we wanted to know more about the pigments related, and so the scientists from Northwestern University scanned within the area delineated in red on the slide here, and generated these elemental maps showing the distribution of those elements which infer pigments over the surface of the painting. And I'd like to just focus on the elemental map for barium particularly. You can see here in the lower left, it's been color enhanced. This is in black and white. and it gives you more detail about an area where Picasso may have blocked in initially the figure of another woman. I've included another painting, an oil on wood, to help you visualize what that might have looked like, perhaps the idea he was working with, that we see in other paintings as well. And I just wanted to show as well that the power of these techniques to show us the chronology of painting. Initially, Picasso painted the bowl here. He's positioned it upward with a more rounded contour. The hands were initially painted very straight, and then in the final composition, they're rounded to match the contour of the bowl. And once again, the X-ray fluorescence complements the information that we have received from the infrared reflectance. It gives us some idea of the pigments used for those particular structures in the course of painting. And this was really dramatic. I found this really exciting to be able to observe how Picasso had actually changed the hairstyle of the woman in the course of painting. Whoops, I've got the wrong one. So on the left, you can see that Picasso has painted with a cadmium paint. The woman's hair is probably cadmium yellow. It's painted with her hair pulled back in a tidy little bun. And then he subsequently paints over in Prussian blue, indicated by iron, but we also see on the final composition, with her bangs hanging down. This is not working. With her bangs hanging down over her forehead rather dramatically. So another really interesting insight into the chronology of painting by the artist. So this one's a little bit harder to see, but you might have to take my word for it. But in the lower left part of the painting, there is fluorescence from the cadmium elemental map and the mercury elemental map, area of fluorescence that defines a rectangular space. And we took a cross-section in the area behind the little girl's heel where there was a little loss, and we discovered that the color in that area alone, just confined to that area, is it's that beautiful yellow color. It's a very bright mixture of a cadmium-based paint and vermilion, indicated by the mercury. So I just wanted to end here just to show you some other paintings by Picasso that relate to that form. The poor man's meal in the upper left, you see the jug, you see a table. In blind man's meal, you see another table in an unusual perspective. Again, the jug, not the vessel, the same shape as in our painting, but perhaps all elements that Picasso was working with in that first use of the canvas.
So Kenneth, can you kind of
Of course.
move quickly? Because we have one more painting to discuss a little bit in depth, which is one that you all are familiar with from the National Gallery, which is their painting Tragedy.
Great, so I will, with your permission, Sue, provide a very, very brief summary. And what we wanted to do with this painting in the exhibition, as many of you see in the catalog and upstairs, is make the argument, and this was really at the instigation of Marilyn McCulley, that the soup is an allegory of charity. And we were lucky to have the owner of this drawing that you see next to this mural by Pierre Puvis de Chavannes write us and alert us to the fact that they owned this drawing. They wanted to include it in the exhibition, and the pose of the woman in the foreground is essentially the woman in the foreground of the mural by Puvis entitled Charity, rotated 180 degrees. And so you can see that within the sequence of sketches related to the soup, we were able, and this is the real new contribution that this exhibition provides, to tie the soup to this mural in Paris, in the Parisian City Hall that Picasso visited, we now know, in late 1902. These are related drawings. You can see how the alignment of the feet of the three figures, you see in one sketch, he maps out that alignment, he achieves it in the next, he creates a more simplified figural group unified by that parallelogram linking the arms of the children to the bull that he literally lifts from Puvis de Chavannes. Now, here is the soup as allegory of charity inspired by Puvis de Chavannes, horizontal in format, you see the blue tonality. When Sue and I were putting together this checklist, you see Nonel again, and his Pobres Esperando la Sopa. Soup is this trope of poverty, it's this trope of nourishment, it's this trope of charity that also Daumier explored in 62, 65, and we include that drawing in the exhibition. And maybe some of you are wondering why. And what Sandra uncovered, and John, the woman who stands with the child with their back to us underneath the soup, we were able, based on this painting on panel that the Museo Picasso Barcelona dates to spring-summer 02, and the drawing that Picasso made for El Liberal, the evening edition of the October 5th, 1902 issue, we were able to posit an approximate date of summer, early fall for that blocked-in figure of a mother standing with her back to the child underneath the soup. And this was the line of evidence we utilized. Also, the pastel was which is that figural group rotated 180 degrees, that Susan Galassi at the Frick, I think through her research, was able to determine that Picasso finished that pastel just before October 19th, 1902, when he returned to Paris for the third time. You see the vestigial jug that is partially scraped away. And this was how we were able to link the tabletop still life to the Daumier, which we explain in the catalog and in the exhibition. But what we found fascinating was Picasso's reliance on Daumier and how he fused it with Puvis. And you see in the painting here on panel how the classicizing garb of the woman who stands with her back to you against the seashore, it's almost as if he's fusing Daumier and Puvis in that figure. But we discussed the La Gourmet earlier, and Sue and I wanted to stage this comparison because you can see the shift from 01 to 03 in Picasso, where in 01, the focus is on this young bourgeois girl and her scraping of the bowl, and she is on the central axis of that composition. And as Harry mentioned, her costume, her curls, her ruddy cheeks, she is the focus. Whereas you look at 03, it's not so much the focus is now on a particular subject, but it's on the gesture of charity, the gesture of handing the bowl. And so you can see the shift from anecdote to allegory in the soup. But we hope that we've given you some sense of what the implications are of the technical studies. But John, if you can discuss the tragedy for us in our remaining time.
Thank you. All right, back to the gallery. What I'm going to do is take you through some of the new findings on the tragedy. This is a well-studied panel painting at the National Gallery of Art. And I would say every new technology we have to analyze new things, this painting comes out and we get to look at it. So the final composition most people are very familiar with is, to me, it's a very somber scene with these three characters. But what's underneath and how it's evolved is the part that's really curious to me. You can read this as a bit of a Rosetta Stone, is the way I understand it. These are images that we've acquired using the hyperspectral technology, and essentially one of the things that's rather interesting about it is that you get all these images taken at different wavelengths of light. And here I'm showing you the wavelength range here, closer to the visible and further in the infrared. But as you go further into the infrared, you go from the drawing associated with the final composition to this example here of a dying horse, to these sketches underneath. As we penetrate further in the infrared, we're going also back in time, as I understand it, as the curators and art historians have realized what these objects consist of and how they relate to what Picasso was doing at the time. And I'll take you through that a bit further. So starting off very close to the current composition, you can see not only the man and the woman, but you see elements in the scene that we have not known before. For example, this arc here, these walls in the back, and what was known as this pole that she seems to be holding, or maybe it was a broom. but these elements still have to be sort of figured out. You do see hints of other things that are going to come up. You see a pair of legs here. You see a bridle of a horse. And you also see some arches, which we'll feature next. One of the questions that was asked was, were there any, by an outside scholar, were there any changes to the final composition? Did he make any changes in the placement? And you can see with the yellow arrow there, for example, the repositioning of the foot of the man. So he did rework this composition a bit. There are some changes associated with the hand of the boy as well. Now, one of the things that the earlier research of the National Gallery had turned up and had made this association between the Sarasa drawing, which I understand relates basically to the dragging out of it of a dying or dead animal from the bullfight, and that this drawing, the drawing by Picasso, you also see this very similar drawing actually on the board itself. And we've been able to get a bit more of the drawing out of it, and what you see in red there are highlights of the actual drawing lines that relate to the Sarasa drawing. And one of the things that's intriguing is the dying horse we'll talk about in a minute on the far right there. He may be associated with these two characters, with the three men that are with the two horses, and maybe the dying horse that's being taken out. You can also see those red arches, which are going to be part of the bullfight scene in a minute. And you can see some other drawing that's related to the other objects in the scene.
So John, in that drawing, you said Savafid very quickly, is that right?
Sorry, again?
Is that drawing his copy of a Mughal theme or
I don't know.
Persian theme? No?
I don't know.
I mean, what we know is that drawing, excuse me, what we know in that drawing, I mean, it was sent to Mexico in July 1902, and you know, it is very Egyptianizing. I mean, you know, when Sue and I were discussing how, when you look at how even background is depicted, it's depicted in the form of a relief, meaning, you know, the protrusion of the horse's snout from behind. I mean, this is more of a relief drawing, and when Sandra, at the end of your presentation, you had that preliminary sketch from Barcelona 02 for the soup, which is similarly Egyptianizing, which shows to us that at least, you know, in 02 in Barcelona around July, there was this Egyptianizing impulse in Picasso's work that I think definitely needs to be further investigated.
Thanks.
One of the questions that comes up related to these paintings and these drawings is, are these drawn elements actually painted out? I said that backwards, but there you go. And that was the sort of the new imaging modalities we have. So now I'm mixing some X-ray elemental fluorescence mapping. In the middle there, you have lead white and mercury associated with, in this case, with vermilion. You can see the dying horse there has a painterly quality to it in the false color infrared, as well as actually maybe some painting lines as well. So that actual figure of the horse was indeed painting, and it is very analogous to the bullfight scene, the dying horse in the bullfight scene. Oh. Huh, okay. Well, we'll move right on to the end. What is not shown there is also an infrared image, an XRF image that shows that the Rasa scene itself and elements associated with the painted horses. So that was not just simply drawn. But there are these characters, when you go further into the infrared, go back further in time, and you start picking up these features on the board. First, you can see the wood grain itself very nicely, but you also see the El Greco figure and a bunch of other sketches and figures and the like. And there you go.
Sue, would you?
Oh, here.
Turn it on.
So
Yeah, turn it on.
we're just making some suggestions here from what we can see. The idea of this board once being in his studio like a sketch pad, you know, that he was doing like graffiti on, you know, a large surface. And the drawing
It's not on.
is not on. Can you hear me with my lavalier? Okay, let's do that. because what you see in the drawing on the right, is a page from 1899, a sheet that he did sketches on also that include this image. Kenneth, if you have the pointer to point out the kind of El Greco style figure that is on the sketches.
And he writes Yo El Greco twice on the sheet. And Sue and I were discussing this, and very briefly, keep in mind in 1899 and 1900, Picasso had 3 different studios, and this is a large panel. So, it's very possible that Picasso carried this panel with him from the studio he shared with the brothers Cardona to the brothers de Soto, and then to the studio he had with Casagemas at the beginning of 1900. I mean, so it just raises this question of, for how long has he been holding on to this panel in 1899 and 1900?
But this is not the only panel painting that he painted on. I mean, he did other, major works on panel. The Old Guitarist in the Art Institute of Chicago is on panel. The Two Sisters that lives in Russia is on panel. So there are, a number of examples of him working on a paneled surface. This is not the only example that we have. It's just the one that we have access to, understanding how long he must have had it in his studio and how many different ways he worked on it. And one of the things that we asked John, I don't know that you have the answer to this question, is to whether the composition of the bullfight might be a finished painting or whether it's just a partially finished idea.
We have some data by the elemental mapping. We have some data. Huh? I'll have to turn it on. There we go. We have some data from the elemental mapping that shows that various aspects of the horses are done, at least red paint done in vermilion. And so, yes, we have some evidence that it was painted. But to what degree of finish, we haven't figured out yet. We will probably have to do some more measurements.
I mean, it's so interesting because traditionally there's no ready evidence that he did bullfight compositions in 1902. He was we have examples of the bullfight as a composition in 1900 and 1901, but in 1902, this would be one of the unique examples of him going back to that Spanish subject matter.
And also the pigments. I mean, from what I understand, we have reds and whites in this bullfight scene. So, as Sue and I were discussing how what this does is definitely complicates the picture of what was happening in his studio in 1902, meaning we understand and what we showcase when we think of 02 are the suffering women of Barcelona.
That's right.
But here he's clearly working on a very ambitious, when you think of the size, a very ambitious bullfight scene. And he's also using pigments that one would not normally associate with the Barcelona blue period of 02. Yeah. And I guess in terms of the surface composition, and just very briefly so that we can take answers and questions and answers, what Sue and I wanted really to emphasize here is, do you see the parallelogram and the alignment of the feet? And Sue and I worked really closely with M.A. Brown Price, who's the scholar of record at Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. And also you see the pose of the poor fisherman that Sue included here compared to the pose of the old bearded man. Also, this is the El Greco that is that accompanies the penitent Magdalene that we associate with the crouching beggar woman, but the Mannerist devices. But in this painting related to tragedy at Smith College, the same parallelogram. And, we just wanted to show how, the tragedy and the soup have a lot of similarities. We can't discuss all of them right now, but this use of the spacing of figural groups that he learns from Puvis in 02, 03, and how we can even see when you look at the sequence of paintings to tragedy, how that governs the logic and the placement of the figures in tragedy, how profound the impact of Puvis is.
So I'm just going to go, because I'm going to give, Harry, I'm going to give you a moment to kind of talk about your
Do we have
last
that?
slides. Why? We'll just
Okay.
do that. I just, we've kind of come to the end of this presentation of the complexity of Picasso's practice and his what we have learned about recycling of his canvases and others, and just an opportunity now to kind of have some last thoughts about what, how we might tie this together, or how Picasso is related to artists contemporary with him doing something different, similar, and then looking further ahead. And so Harry's got a few things to stimulate our thoughts. I think you're going backwards.
Oh, I'm holding it the wrong way. Okay. So I was, see, this is on, yeah. No, you can hear me, right? Yes. I was trying to think about other cases of this recycling, and there might be whole books written on it, I don't know. I couldn't really think of any until I thought of Cezanne and a couple of examples that are pretty well known in the field from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and so this bailiff stuck. And I'm so happy that we were looking at the crouching beggar woman with that, the way we saw that the figure was inserted into that landscape. So in this case, laser pointer, there's a head of Madame Cezanne right there, and her lapels are here and here, and so that's her head, and the body was here. It was rotated 90 degrees from a portrait format to a landscape format. And I don't have the IR, the infrared, with me, I'm sorry. I don't keep that in my pocket. But it's so interesting that here's another artist doing it, and an artist who didn't have to do it because he was well off. We normally think of Picasso having to do this because he, couldn't afford another canvas, and maybe he had to decide which painting he's going to sacrifice and paint over. And Cezanne didn't have to do that. And with Cezanne, as with we've seen several examples in Picasso, he didn't take that canvas and cover it. He kept the image and seemingly wanted to respond to that image with a new image in whatever way, which which I think makes us wonder, well, this isn't just a matter of being thrifty, and what was being said earlier also about texture and wanting texture and to pick up on texture, maybe have a painting that was already pre-textured that he could take advantage of,
right.
or take advantage of images. So all of that, I think, is it opens up the interpretation beyond just he needed another canvas and he couldn't afford one. That's obvious. What do I do now? Could you advance one? Thanks. Yeah, so other painting from Philadelphia where there's this strange element here. Looks like still life element here, and it is in one layer, and then there's a subsequent layer which shows that was a head and shoulders portrait with the canvas cropped there, which is why this painting is so small, 18 by 15 inches. So Cezanne doing a trifecta there, and playing with the whole process of moving from one image to another. And when Sue was talking about that board, which functions as a kind of sketchbook, and I didn't know you were going to do that, but if you could advance one more. So we know on the left here that Cezanne loved to associate images in his sketchbook. Here, a pretty famous one of his head with that round dome and his famous apple, sort of making an equation there. And the one on the right is from the Giacometti show at the Met, where you see Giacometti associating two of his great gods, Cezanne and Egyptian art. So this is a case of, not one thing covering another, but one thing next to another, but they're very similar processes. We could think about psychoanalysis even, and dream work, and the idea that either an image comes to replace another, or it comes sort of next to another. And I think whenever we're looking into paintings, underneath paintings, it's so interesting to think about what is remembered, what is forgotten, what is conscious, and what is unconscious. And I just want to congratulate everybody on doing this amazing technical work, which museums are not doing enough of, because it's so labor intensive and expensive. And I'm so glad that we're still doing it. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, everyone here. I want to thank all of my colleagues on the stage here today, and because this is an opportunity for all of us to kind of get together and brainstorm in a way that we don't always have. And thank you, Harry, for bringing another perspective and another voice into this, and reminding us that artistic decision making is never just simple and cut and dry. That it has a lot of things that go into it. And so I don't know if people have questions. I know we're over time, but happy to go and entertain questions that people might have.
Good afternoon, everyone. We do have a few minutes for questions. Audience members, if you continue to raise your hands. I do have one question, Sue, from our online viewers that we wanted to bring to the panelists. And the question's from Marianne, who says, given the many examples of Picasso's recycling canvases, my question is why? Why, for example, did he give up the park scene for the Crouching Beggar?
Well, what we argue is simply that this was a canvas. We do not know who painted that landscape, and we never will. And there was no signature, and the pigments could really be owned by any modernista painter in Barcelona at the turn of the century. What we do know is that only a select group of artists associated with El Quatre Gats, the beer hall tavern cafe, which was the site of the Barcelona Modernistas, that was where they congregated. We know that someone loosely associated with that group painted that site. Why would Picasso paint over it? I think that when he returned from Paris to Barcelona in 1902, he really felt required, obligated to respond to Nonel. Nonel was in February 13th, 1902, Sebastián Junyat referred to him as the future of Catalan painting. So you think of a young artist who returns to his city, Barcelona, after he's in Paris, introduced to symbolism, painting the woman of Saint Lazare. He comes back home and he sees this guy Nonel, he's 8 years my senior, he's called the future of Catalan painting, but I better get into the mix too. He starts painting impoverished women. And here's this canvas that he either parked at his parents' home before he went to Paris in 1901, or it was just hanging around the Calle Nu de la Rambla studio that he shared with De Soto. And for him, it was simply, this landscape is useless to me, and I need to engage Nonel. And this landscape's not going to help me engage Nonel, so I'm just going to paint over it. But you see that, in his engagement with Nonel, he still felt that he needed to bring the symbolism of Rossignol, who was a generation ahead of Picasso and Nonel, forward in his rejection of Nonel as he was engaging Nonel. So I really feel that this was just a canvas that was available to him, that had no use to him at that particular time in January, February 1902. And he was inspired by its forms, as Harry says, meaning, Picasso is definitely using the visual logic of similitude. He's seeing a visual similarity between the undulating line of the woman's back and the tree line, but that landscape does not help him engage in rivalry with Nonal.
And Kenneth, you're also sure that it wasn't by Picasso.
We do not know, but I was very
sound pretty
careful.
sure.
No, but I was very careful. I was very careful, Harry, to say it was an artist associated with Quatre Gats, which means it could be Picasso, but we do not know. But what we do know is that when the symbolists had access to that park in 1897 or 98, when we saw that performance of Maragall and Utrillo, Picasso was in Madrid.
Let's just say it's not by Picasso. It doesn't look like Picasso.
But we can't say that though either. But I mean, stylistically, the dates do not line up. But there are people such as Edouard Valles, who has studied Picasso much longer than I have, who thinks there is a real possibility. So we're willing to keep it open.
Bill Robinson up at Cleveland also thinks that, who's a Picasso scholar that has spent his entire career kind of immersed in Blue Period Picasso, thinks that we have to keep the door open to whether Picasso might have painted that landscape, not because of what the landscape depicts, or even the fact that the scale is something so kind of unusual that Picasso would have engaged in a landscape of that size in the years prior, but simply because some scholars like Bill think that Picasso didn't engage regularly in getting canvases that were painted by someone else and repurposing them. That we have a few examples that we can document, but in general, what has been known to date, and that's the important thing we need to keep in mind, is what is known to date, is that he generally seems he recycles his own canvases, but that it doesn't, there are just a lot of issues about that particular landscape, and the large size is one of the real question marks. I know Kenneth spent a lot of time looking at what landscapes do exist. And the one thing we have about Picasso in the pre-Blue Period years is that he left a lot of these things with his family, and his family kept everything. They may have put it in a trunk, may have been, in a closet someplace, but his family kept everything. And Picasso himself was obsessive about keeping most everything, as through his career also. So it's just, we can't find anything like it, is what we say.
But what we also do know, Harry, and Sue, you know this as well as anyone, that the Portrait of a Lady 1903 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is painted over the Juli Gonzalez Catalan landscape, which he also rotated counterclockwise 90 degrees before painting over.
But that one is signed, and that's how we know.
Right.
That one has a signature on it, so we can identify the artist.
So to Bill Robinson and Edward Valles, I also say, well, fine, we can say that he rarely recycled other people's work, but we actually do have this X-ray of a signed landscape over which he painted. But to conclude this question, what was fascinating for me and for Sue, when we were in Barcelona speaking with different scholars, the Rossignol scholars wanted Picasso to paint over a Rossignol landscape, and they were bullish that this was by Rossignol. And then when we would talk to the Picasso scholars, that would be far too iconoclastic for Picasso to do. So I mean, so believe me, there's no agreement.
We should probably go to some other questions, but thank you. I'm sorry I got us into that rabbit hole, but very interesting.
Wonderful, thank you. We have time for one question from the live audience.
Mr. Delaney, I would like to ask, what is a data cube? What is a data cube? Is it a stack of images using different analytical techniques or something? You used the term data cube in your presentation.
Cube, when you talk about a
And it actually
cube.
showed up-
Yes.
Yeah.
And it actually showed up on the screen there. So you used the term a data cube, and I wonder what that meant in
It's
terms
like
of your
somewhere
work.
at the beginning.
Data cube, data
Yeah, sure.
cube. Yeah, data cube.
Way at the beginning.
Sure, I spoke loosely, I apologize for that. The type of images, the imaging that we're doing takes hundreds of photographs and a very narrow portion of wavelength, range of light. It's only a few nanometers. So we would take, in this case, 200 images between 970 nanometers and 1,700 nanometers. So you can imagine all of these images, stacking them up, aligning them where their wavelengths are. And you could actually play it like a little movie and see how the painting changes as you look at these little narrow spectral bands at the work of art through. Or we can exploit that and get specific spectra of how the reflectance changes.
This one here.
There's an example there showing the cube spatially in 2 dimensions, and then that sort of color dimension is the wavelength dimension. That's where the individual images line up.
The paint dries at different rates too, and he just keeps on moving, and you have to figure out what layer he's really working at.
Exactly. The trick is somewhere in that cube, there's the transition between where paint becomes absorbing and reflecting. And so it's at that transition edge we can start to see a composition that's on top, and when that paint that's on top becomes transmitting, in this case Prussian blue becomes transmitting around 1,400 nanometers, you start to see what's underneath. The next layer of paint shows up. And so that's how we dial through.
I want to add to that, you need to be very careful about what you're looking at and know what can be seen through, and not see things in these images. You need to know the artwork and know that you're looking at. So for instance, in the blue room, there was a whole corner that you couldn't see through, or there was an area that we first thought, the rug was come up from the underlying image, and it didn't. But you have to look at these things for a long time, and you can start seeing anything in them.
I think this is an incredibly important part. This work can't be done without the team. Scientists can collect data, but the analysis of that requires the conservator, and the curator is heavily involved. We're familiar with material. It's not possible to do it any other way.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do one more question.
Simply, why blue?
Why blue?
Blue is very much a color associated with the emotion of melancholy. Picasso certainly isn't the first artist, who worked in that manner. And it's interesting to see that there's a kind of transition, into blue over the course of 1901, from the late summer, through the end of the year, and that the manner in which he paints with blue, the tonalities of blue that he uses also change and shift. It's not just a kind of squeeze it out of the tube and put it onto the canvas. I mean, if there's one thing that I have learned from talking with Patty and trying to understand our painting the blue room, is that Prussian blue is a pigment that she can explain this better than I can, that has a lot of flexibility. And Picasso would mix other colors with it, mix white, mix red, mix yellow with it, and in 2015, a colleague who is the chief conservator at the Musée Picasso Barcelona, who's a leader in looking at Picasso's work, she did a symposium that Patty presented at that was essentially about how blue is the blue period, and the kind of spectrum of color that you see in this categorization that we've all taken to heart as being descriptive of these years, these early years of Picasso's work. But you can see, even if up in the gallery, the the variety of blue that he was working with. It was not just one particular color, even though it could be Prussian blue all the way, but he changed the way that Prussian blue looks on the canvas.
Sure, I'll add, yeah, so Prussian blue, until you get to the end, that's all you see for the most part. And it has a very high tinting strength, so a little bit goes a long way. It wasn't very expensive to begin with. And depending on what color you're using, zinc white versus lead white. Lead white's more opaque, so you're going to get a different value set, zinc white may be more versatile because he could be more nuanced with it. And then I think, and that's just from my knowledge of our painting, and then I think getting into further into the Barcelona paintings, he's mixing with like ochres and cadmium yellow to get those modulations in the green and yellow.
One thing that's interesting, and Patty brought it up in her description of the blue room, is that because we're talking Prussian blue predominantly throughout this period, but that in our painting, that small seascape that's in the back wall, he chose to use ultramarine. Now, you can't necessarily tell that that's a different blue pigment with the naked eye, but it was clearly important to Picasso to make that change. Using ultramarine in his own work, a seascape, but also a color that is so completely associated with the, not in its synthetic form, but throughout the kind of history of Renaissance art with the blue robes of the Virgin. So that it had a symbolic meaning potentially for him, but he knew that he put ultramarine in that painting, even though we wouldn't necessarily, be aware of that. Thank you all today. You've been great. Thank you.